Hey guys, I'm back with the next chapter in the Book of Joy, which is Illness and Fear of Death. I prefer to go to hell. The trip was bookended by funerals. We had to change the flight itinerary to India and back twice because dear friends of Archbishop Tutu had died. Although these were funerals for men who had lived good long lives, it was a fitting reminder of death and of the limited time each of us has. Certainly, illness and mortality are two of the great verities and sources of suffering in our lives. Be careful, lots of my friends are dying, the Archbishop said when we had just arrived at the airport, wagging a finger at the Dalai Lama. Then he went on to say what a great man Philip Potter, one of the deceased, had been. He was the first black general secretary of the World Council of Churches, he explained. But with the Archbishop, sanctity and levity, death and life were close bedfellows. So even as he was honoring his friend, he began to tell a joke. He was a very formidable man, much taller than you and me. Yesterday I was looking at his coffin. It was a massive thing. Both of us would have gone in there, and I would have gone to heaven. And where would you have gone? Most probably hell, the Dalai Lama replied. The conversation about death and who was going to heaven and hell was one of the jokes that they played with throughout the week, making fun of their traditions and conflicting pieties. I asked them to make the subject of illness and death more personal. How do you think about your own deaths? You're both in your 80s and it's a reality, or at least a possibility, hopefully far in the future. Quite polite, the Dalai Lama said and laughed. Well, he doesn't mind too much, the Archbishop cut in, pointing at the Dalai Lama, because for him, there's reincarnation. With reincarnation, the Dalai Lama responded, I'm not really sure where I will be born, so much uncertainty, but you are quite sure you're going to heaven. Since the Chinese say they're going to decide where you were reincarnated, the Archbishop responded, you must be nice to them. The Archbishop then looked down as if focusing inwardly on the seriousness of the question, his own mortality. I should say that for a very long time, the thought of my demise was something that brought a great deal of anxiety. I know I've had a number of near-fatal illnesses. As a child, I had polio, and they say that my father went off to buy the wood for making my coffin, and my mother went off to get herself black clothes because they thought I was at the end. In my teenage years, I developed tuberculosis and went to a TB hospital where I noticed that almost all the patients who started to hemorrhage, coughing up blood, ended up being pushed out on a trolley to the mortuary. I must have been about 15 or so when I began coughing up blood too. I was sitting down with this receptacle in front of me, and each time I coughed, blood just came out that way. I said, God, if this is curtains for me, then it's okay. I have to admit, I was surprised at the calm and the peace that came over me. Well, of course, you know that they didn't wheel me out on a trolley to the mortuary. Many years later, I met up with Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, who used to come when I was in hospital and visit me weekly for months on end. So it was many years after, when we were both archbishops, that he said he was told by the doctor, Your young friend, meaning me, is not going to make it. Well, I guess I seem to have made it for a bit since then. I have often thought about the strength the archbishop gained from facing illness and death so early in life. Illness is one of the most common sources of suffering and adversity that people face. And yet, even here, as with my father, people can find meaning and spiritual growth in it. In many ways, it's probably the most common motivation for people to reevaluate and transform their lives. It's almost a cliche that people with serious or life-threatening illnesses start to savor each moment and to be more fully alive. I worked on a book many years ago with a physician who cared for seriously ill and dying patients. He made a powerful distinction between healing and curing. Curing involves the resolution of the illness, but was not always possible. Healing, he said, was coming to wholeness and could happen whether or not the illness was curable. The Archbishop explained how he was planning to be cremated to conserve space and wanted a simple funeral to encourage others in his country to avoid the expensive caskets and ceremonies that are traditional. Even in death, moral leaders teach by their choices. Then the Archbishop looked at me and said with a common sense finality, Death is a fact of life. You are going to die. The Archbishop continued, It's actually a wonderful thing to do what they call a living will, where you are giving instructions for when the end comes. It's not being morbid. You're saying that this is a fact of life. I've conducted a number of funerals myself, and I've come to the stage where I'm saying, by the way, this is where you're going. That could so easily be you now. Yes, of course, there's a kind of nostalgia for the things that you have had that you will miss. I will miss my family. I will miss the person who has been my partner for these 60 years. There are many things that I will miss. But in this Christian tradition to which I belong, I will be entering into a fuller life. It is wonderful. I mean, imagine if we didn't die. Our poor world would not be able to carry the burden. It's not able to carry the burden of 7 billion as it is. I mean, I've had a beginning, I've had a middle, and I'll have an end. There's a lovely symmetry about it. Symmetry. He laughed as he lingered over the word and repeated it. If we didn't die, imagine the number of people that would be in the world now. I hope that the things I believe about heaven are really true. That I will meet my loved ones, my parents, my older brother, whom I didn't know because he died in infancy. I will meet many wonderful stalwarts. I want to meet St. Augustine. I want to meet St. Thomas Aquinas and people who have taught us so much about praying. Because God is infinite, because none of us who are creatures will ever fathom the infinitude that is God, heaven is going to be forever a place of new discovery. The Archbishop's eyes were transfixed, his gaze distant. I would say, "Oh God, you're so beautiful." And I will call, come and see. And this other one will say, "Have you just seen how beautiful God is?" The Archbishop fell silent. Perhaps death and the fear of death is truly the greatest challenge to joy. Well, when we are dead, it does not really matter, but it is the fear of its approaching, of the suffering that often precedes it, and ultimately the fear of the oblivion and the loss of our personhood that frightens us. Many psychologists say the fear of death lies behind all other fears, and many historians of religion argue that religion arose to try and solve the mystery of death. Modern life keeps that fear at bay, as we don't interact with the very old or the very sick, and illness, frailty, and death get tucked away behind institutional walls from our everyday lives. After a few moments, the Dalai Lama began speaking. I think for thousands of years, the human mind has been curious about death, and many traditions have many ideas and concepts of what will happen next. Heaven, as you mentioned, is a beautiful understanding. Shintoism in Japan also has the idea that after death, you automatically go to heaven where all your ancestors are living. When many people think about death, they are very, very afraid. Usually I tell them that you should accept that death is part of our life. There's a beginning and there's an end, as you mentioned. So once we accept that it is normal and that sooner or later it will come, our attitude changes. Some people are embarrassed when asked about their age or pretend that they're still young. This is silly, deceiving oneself. We should be realistic. Yes, yes, the Archbishop agreed. If a person is sick, the Dalai Lama said, it is much better to accept that you have some kind of illness and get medical treatment rather than saying nothing is wrong and deceiving yourself. While the Archbishop was in Dharamsala, we had arranged for him to see Yeshi Dandan, one of the Dalai Lama's doctors. Rachel is an integrative physician and was interested to know if this revered healer might have helpful recommendations for the Archbishop, whose prostate cancer was now back. In an amazing coincidence, Dr. Dondon had helped cure my mother of blood cancer while he was visiting New York many years ago when I was still in high school. Sorry, Oliver is running in his sleep. When I was in Dharamsala in January preparing for the visit, I was told that Dr. Dondon had died, but I had just heard that he was still alive at almost 90. I was excited to meet him, to thank him for helping to save my mother's life, and to see if he might be able to help the Archbishop. He came into the Archbishop's bedroom at the hotel, his bald head and large ears making him look a little like an only slightly taller Yoda from the Star Wars movies. His face was impassive and his hands had a powerful delicacy while they took the Archbishop's pulse. The Archbishop was lying on his king-size bed. Through the windows, the valleys of Dharamsala plunged down in steep hillsides of oaks and evergreens, ending with a vista of the vast plains below. Through a translator, Dr. Dondon begins to describe health issues that the Archbishop had experienced decades ago and that had led to his current prostate cancer. The Archbishop looked surprised as Rachel, who was familiar with many traditional medical symptoms, explained what Dr. Dondon was saying in a way that made sense to a modern medical understanding of the body. After a 15 or 20-minute exam, Dr. Dondon pointed to the can of Coke Zero on the bedside table. The Archbishop has given up the rum and cokes he used to favor, but he's still quite fond of his Coke Zero, having agreed to the diet soda to cut down on his sugar consumption. According to Dr. Dondon, the Coke Zero was still not helping his health and should be removed from his diet. When this was translated to the Archbishop, he got out of his bed rather spryly and jokingly waved his hands, saying, "I think it's time for you to go." Rachel assured the Archbishop that while she had been trying to get him to kick his Coke Zero habit for years, at 84 he was allowed to eat and drink what he pleased. Dr. Dondon made some additional recommendations, Photos were taken together of the famous doctor and famous patient, and then the good doctor left. As a Buddhist practitioner, the Dalai Lama said, I take seriously the contemplation of the Buddha's first teaching about the inevitability of suffering and the transient nature of our existence. Also, the Buddha's last teaching at the time of his death ends with the truth of impermanence, reminding us how it is the nature of all things that come into existence to have an end. The Buddha said nothing lasts. So it is important that in our daily meditation practice, we continue to think about our own mortality. There are two levels of impermanence. At the grosser level, life keeps changing and things cease to exist, including us. At the more subtle level, in every single moment, everything is changing, something science is able to show us happening even at the atomic and subatomic level. Our body is constantly changing, as is our mind. Everything is in a constant state of change. Nothing remains static, and nothing remains permanent. In fact, as the Buddha reminds us, the very causes that have given rise to something, such as our life, have created the mechanism or the seed for that thing's eventual end. Recognizing this truth is an important part of the contemplation on impermanence. Then I ask why impermanence happens. The answer is because of interdependence. Nothing happens independently. So this kind of contemplation is part of my usual daily meditation practice. This practice is actually to help one prepare for death, the intermediate state, and then rebirth. So in order to carry out the practice effectively, you should reflect on these things and visualize the process of death. Finally, I think you mentioned that we old people should prepare for death, and it is important to make space for the future, for younger generations. What is important to remember is that sooner or later death comes, and to make our life meaningful while we're alive. I think maximum lifespan is about 100 years. Compared to human history, 100 years is quite short. So if we utilize that short period to create more problems on this planet, our life would be meaningless. If we could live for a million years, then maybe it would be worthwhile to create some problems. But our life is short. Now you see, we are guests here on this planet, visitors who have come for a short time. So we need to use our days wisely to make our world a little better for everyone. Jinpa explained that there is a profound teaching by an ancient Tibetan master. The true measure of spiritual development is how one confronts one's own mortality. The best way is when one is able to approach death with joy. Next best way is without fear. Third best way is to at least not have regrets. So earlier I was explaining about the night that we fled from Norbalinka, the Dalai Lama said, now turning to his own experiences of facing the fear of death. For me, that was the most frightening night of my life, the night of the 17th of March, 1959. At that time, my life really was in danger. I still remember the alertness of mind I felt as I stepped out of the Norbalinka Palace in disguise, dressed in a Tibetan layman's clothes. All my efforts to calm down the situation in Lhasa had failed. A huge crowd of Tibetans had gathered outside the Norbalinka Palace, wanting to block any attempts on the part of the Chinese military to take me away. I had tried my best, but both sides, the Chinese and the Tibetans, were deeply entrenched in their positions. Of course, the Tibetan side was deeply devout and was trying to protect me. The Dalai Lama paused and looked reflective as he recalled the devotion of his people and their self-sacrifice for his safety. The spontaneous gathering of Tibetans outside Norbalinka Palace was the culmination of days of uprising against the communist Chinese occupation by the Tibetan people that first began on March 10, 1959. This time, the public had come to prevent the Chinese authorities from taking the Dalai Lama away from Norbalinka Palace, supposedly for his own personal safety. Something had to happen. The situation was explosive, and the Dalai Lama knew that it could only lead to a massacre. So that night, the 17th of March, 1959, the plan for my escape was executed. We went at night and in disguise along a road that followed a river. On the other side of the river was the Chinese military barracks. We could see the guards. No one in our party was allowed to use flashlights, and we tried to minimize the sound of the horses' hoofs. But still there was danger. If they saw us and opened fire, we were finished. Yet, as a Buddhist practitioner, I thought of Shantideva's somewhat stern advice. If there is a way to overcome the situation, then instead of feeling too much sadness, too much fear, or too much anger, make an effort to change the situation. If there's nothing you can do to overcome the situation, then there is no need for fear or sadness or anger. So I told myself at that moment that even if something were to happen to me, it would still be okay. You face the facts, the reality, and making an attempt to escape was the best response in the face of that reality. Actually, fear is part of human nature. It's a natural response that arises in the face of danger. But with courage, when in fact real dangers come, you can be more fearless, more realistic. On the other hand, if you let your imagination run wild, then you exacerbate the situation further and then bring more fear. Many people on this planet worry about going to hell, but this is not much use. There's no need to be afraid. While we remain on the earth worrying about hell, about death, about all the things that could go wrong, we will have lots of anxiety and we will never find joy and happiness. If you are truly afraid of hell, you need to live your life with some purpose, especially through helping others. So, the Dalai Lama finally said, slapping the Archbishop on the wrist playfully, I prefer to go to hell than to heaven. I can solve more problems in hell. I can help more people there. That's the end of that chapter. We're about halfway through this book already. All right, I hope everyone is enjoying it. So much in here that's really good. It's one of my favorite books. And we'll be back tomorrow with the next chapter. Talk to you soon.